Rebuilding the foundations of Warcraft. PC Gamer has recently had an interview with Ian Hazzikostas, as well as this interview being covered by Wowhead, and I found it incredibly interesting, so much so that I wanted to cover it in today's video, as you know, the discussions around the future of World of Warcraft are always at the forefront. There's always just content being slammed out onto the internet talking about, is WoW dead? What is the direction of WoW? Where is it going? Is it possible to, change direction at this point, or trajectory? And this interview definitely opens up a lot in terms of the discussion towards that. So in the first point here, Ian Hazzikostas via PC Game, the last few years really have been a time of introspection and re-examination of all of the building blocks, the design, the DNA of WoW, he said. Turning over every stone, holding it up to the light and examining it and asking ourselves, this clearly served us well for a long time. Is it still the right thing for our players in 2024? And in many cases, the answer is yes. Put the stone back and we continue. In other cases, it's time to rebuild some foundations. I think the points that he's likely talking about with this are things like meaningful choice in Shadowlands. So their intent wasn't to make, a feature of the expansion something that made players miserable and really upset when they had you choose a covenant and be locked into it. That was the intent around meaningful choice. Your character is making a decision that requires a serious commitment and you can't go back on it. But for the majority of people that are playing World of Warcraft, they're playing it on a more competitive level, and they're also playing it with more alts, so they want to be able to explore more options, right? If you pick one character and you play it through, and then you get to the end and you get kind of bored, but then you look at, how annoying, what are the roadblocks to respecing to a different covenant, or what are the roadblocks of changing some conduits, and then this all just becomes friction in you being able to explore the rest of the game and still give yourself playtime, which was likely why this feature in particular actually received a lot of negative criticism. I think so much so that it was probably like the major breaking point for Shadowlands' decline as far as gameplay systems, right? We could talk narrative, and I think they do talk narrative a little bit later on in the interview, but as far as gameplay choices, I think for most people in the modern game now, they want to be able to play and see as many different perspectives as possible. And also when you're dealing with LFG in a lot of cases, you get gate kept. So if you pick a specialization that's not a top performer and you can't re-roll because you've put in hundreds of hours in leveling it and hundreds of hours of gearing it, but now nobody's going to invite you to your group, you probably just end up leaving the game when you're in that position. Whereas if it is possible to re-roll to something or to try something different, you may give that at least a second thought before quitting the game entirely. Now that obviously can go off the back of game balance, right? I think we're seeing right now, at least in the current competitive scene for Mythic Plus, for example, that there is not a lot of representation as far as classes are considered. And I'm very curious to see what they're going to try to do to deal with that, because in reality, with PvE balance, with raid versus dungeon, that is inherently already going to create imbalance. If you're balancing for raids, dungeons are going to be imbalanced. If you balance for dungeons, then raids are going to be imbalanced. So they've got an interesting decision to make here as far as like, what do they want to focus on, or can they find a way to separate them the same way that they've separated PvP with PvP tuning adjustments? You can have dungeon tuning adjustments, right? If a class is overperforming in a dungeon but is not performing well in the raid, because dungeons are typically AoE and dungeons raids are usually single targets about boss damage. There's a huge difference of focus on what you want in terms of output in those two modes of gameplay. I think that is likely the only way that you could properly balance this, so that Mythic Plus has more representation, so that people on classes get to see their specs in the tournament, but more importantly, so their specs can actually get invited to a group when they're signing up in LFG. So I would personally like to see that. I haven't seen any points of discussion as far as them doing that. I would say typically in the past that they don't like doing individual tuning. The only thing that I have seen somewhat in that direction is that they've taken a bunch of raid healing mechanics like Tranquility and Healing Tide Totem, and they've decided to amplify those effects in non-raid environments to make them more viable. And it's those types of adjustments, but more of them and a little more specific, that I think will likely increase that variety and representation for specs, because that's got to be one of the number one things that causes player retention to go down, is game balance. Because when your spec isn't good enough to be invited in groups and you get frustrated and you can't find anyone to play with, you're just gonna stop playing the game like that. Like if we're not even talking about like getting new players at this point, we're just talking about keeping the current players. You have to change something in that regard. This topic has come up several times since the decline of Shadowlands, as Blizzard has set out to re-examine the foundations of World of Warcraft, asking themselves if the ideas of the past are still relevant today. Although some mistakes are destined to be repeated, Blizzard received a wake-up call after subscriber numbers had failed to stabilize with the launch of Dragonflight, as revealed then by franchise general manager John Hyde. I think also they lost the China market at some point. I'm trying to remember what the time frame was on that. If that was, I want to say it was before Dragonflight, but losing an entire region of the world's subscriber base is going to be kind of hard to recover from. I don't know if I would put this all on the shoulders of Dragonflight, like not meeting some sort of expectation, because you know, maybe narrative was a little bit light for Dragonflight, but almost everything else was phenomenal. And now if they're applying an improved narrative to this Soul Saga that they're doing with this trilogy that they're doing, then there's no reason that the War Within, especially with China now back into it, that their subscriber count is probably going to be, I would expect to be very high. With the War Within, we're seeing major characters coming back into the play. We're seeing a lot of class fantasy focus. They've got a whole bunch of feedback based on the systems that have moved forward, and I'm expecting this to be like a huge release, honestly, given that they have that market back. But do take that into account with this interview. I think developer conference lecture reflecting on 30 years of Warcraft. These dwindling subscriber trends indicated a major problem. The players who left weren't coming back, and again, that is because the player base is aging. I mean, I have analytics on my YouTube that show that as well. Like the viewership of my videos, I used to have like 15% of people were aged like, what was it, like 17 to 25. That's down to like 6% now. And then my age 25 to 34 has gone up like 7%. So the people that used to be 17 to 24 are now 24 to 35, and some of the 24 to 35s are now 36 to 40 something. So the player base is aging, right? And I think it's because video games are similar to music genres, right? MMORPGs could be the jazz of music. You know, in its time, in its wake, it was pumping. Everybody really loved it, and all the people that grew up with jazz continued to listen to it. But it doesn't have an insane growth of new listeners. It has some new listeners, but it's not an insanely new growth compared to new genres that come out like metal or pop or whatever else you really want to use as an example here. So it's tough to like, how do you sell the new generation on an old genre? Because that's the same problem that jazz music has had. And they're trying things, right? They tried Plunderstorm, mixing in some battle royale genre, mixing in a little bit of metal in with the jazz. But I'm not sure if that's enough to get people to play World of Warcraft. I think Plunderstorm on its own as a standalone could have been fantastic in terms of trying to get that battle royale audience. But it probably would have taken people out of WoW into Plunderstorm, particularly like the PvP people out of WoW into Plunderstorm, and actually brought WoW numbers down. So how do you bring back the MMORPG genre? We see tons of other studios kind of cutting back on their MMORPG development and kind of putting it on hold for right now because it's a super expensive game to make, and it's not showing any signs that there's interest from a younger audience. It's basically us in that jazz era. So you're creating a super expensive jazz music for this lump sum of people, which if you can get them to play, is probably still very lucrative, or else they wouldn't keep doing it. But the biggest challenge is just getting new people, and I don't have any ideas personally here. They show some of the dips in the subscriber count. With Shadowlands, you know, the meaningful choice era, where there wasn't a lot of listening to feedback, and the mass exodus. And then Dragonflight, they were expecting, you know, this, I think this blue line was the expectation of what they would get, but it was much lower. The thing is the downward trend even started in BFA, right? Like BFA, at the end of BFA was still lower than, you know, this critical period of Shadowlands, which had so much controversy route in it. BFA was honestly lower than that point. So I think BFA was honestly kind of the downward turn. I think in Legion, they implemented awesome narrative, the strongest narrative we've seen in probably almost any expansion. And at the time, artifact power was super fun and everybody liked it. It was like, oh my god, my character's always powering up and there's something I can do in the game and I feel like it's always worth my time to do something. But people had burnt out on it. And then by the time that burnout happened, they thought that everybody was still, yay, give us Azerite power. And so they gave it to us again, but everybody was already burnt out on it. And because of that, I think was what caused most of this decline. And I don't think the narrative was as good as Legion, but Legion is like, how do you talk? Like, this is like your hit single, right? Like, even as a musician, not every single song is going to be your hit single. You're going to hit your hit single on Legion. It might take a while, but it's been a while now, and we're getting into the War Within, and this could easily be a hit single doing this Soul Saga strategy. And now that they're listening to what the players are giving for feedback, as opposed to here just assuming that oh, people liked artifact power, we'll just keep doing it. And then, hey, no, we didn't actually really like it. Maybe we burnt out on it. We need to rewind it. So as long as they're aware of those main critical issues moving into an expansion and change course before it comes out, which I think they've been doing a good job of so far, then I anticipate this could be really good, assuming that the narrative is strong. But these failures led to a radical shift in the team's design philosophy, reevaluating how players engage with the game, and the 2-decade-old expectations placed upon them. What executive producer Holly Longdale would call the third era of World of Warcraft. While the launch of Dragonflight may have already been compromised by the failures of Shadowlands, the expansion continued on to record post-launch subscriber growth and stability. And this is in account to their new release cadence. They had more content more frequently, and the trading post. I think having fear of missing out, cosmetics every month, like, oh my god, this insane water gun or this Star Galactic transmog, like I had to subscribe just to even get this. Those were really good at getting the people who had left, which, let's be honest, we've entered a new meta game of gaming, which is you play a game for like a month and then you stop playing it, you play something else. And it's because the market, there's so many more games, there's more competition, and the marketing for all those games constantly targets your FOMO. Like, play this game in the first week and you get a unique mount. But the thing is, you stop playing that game in a month anyways, and you forget that you had the mount in the first place, but they already got you. And that's the main hook that they're trying to get you. So Blizzard has done a better job of getting more hooks more frequently, I would say, in their game with the trading post. Subscribe, there's this new mount, you can only get it for this month, and there's this new transmog, you only get it for this month, and then having content on top of that, like, you know, new specs coming out, class reworks, new zones, new storytelling areas, and I think personally, at least for Dragonflight, it's just the narrative. It's kind of went a little loose. It felt like it was like filler content in an anime, which is cool, you know, just a fun little moment for it, but it seems like the War Within is getting a lot more focused in on that specifically, and they talk about that here with the things that went wrong with the story and setting. Afterlife setting wasn't accessible, new antagonist wasn't developed, well-known story heroes were diminished, systems didn't evolve with player expectations. So it's talking about like the Azerite power and the, you know, the meaningful choice, borrowed power, not enough variety, gaps in content, lack of transparency, and didn't feel heard. And I think that they have improved on pretty much every single aspect of this, right? And this is the thing that you have to do, right? You got to face the truth a little bit, you know? You can't just like cover your ears and pretend it's not there, especially when it's like so overwhelmingly vocal and it's affecting your bottom line. So the fact that they outlined it, they could say like, here, these are the things we think went specifically wrong, and they have worked on every single aspect of this moving into the next expansion is really good. That's a really promising thing. With this comes warbands, account-wide progression system, several iterations of Mythic Plus affixes in the War Within, a greater focus on overarching story, more evergreen systems, and content built to last expansions rather than being abandoned. Ian Hazacostas via PC Gamer said, I think it was beginning but definitely accelerated over the course of Shadowlands, where from a design perspective especially, we had a bit of a reckoning. You know, Hazacostas said, we had built systems and leaned on what seemed like honored WoW principles, like deep investment in your character and meaningful choice and differentiation. But when we were hearing from players was, that's not what we want anymore. I did this one, why do I have to do it again? I don't want this power to be tied to a cosmetic choice. I want them to be separate. There's no great reveal here, no new information that suddenly solves every problem any player may have had with the game over the last few years. It only signifies that Blizzard is listening and taking to heart the concerns that players have been raising, looking for places where the traditional way of doing things may not quite be so relevant 20 years later. This roller coaster of subscriber trends has taught the developers an important lesson, though. Players are evolving, but they don't want to leave the games they love behind. Blizzard is striving to evolve with them, giving them a reason to stay and continue to enjoy the games they love. Another quote here, that kind of began that process of like asking ourselves, these were lessons that were instilled in us by our forebears as designers on the team, as developers on the team, but are we going to blindly cling to them, as Acosta said, or are we going to face that reality that players have changed, the way people approach WoW has changed, and it's our duty as caretakers of this world not to just stubbornly cling to our original version, but to evolve and meet them where they are, and to ensure that Azeroth remains a place they want to be. And I think this evolving to where they are thing is because we're all getting to be 35. Either, you know, maybe half of us are in our mom's basement and still just, you know, neck bearding it out, and then half of us have families and can only play for 20 minutes and need to AFK constantly. So the fact that they're developing content like delves, so you can just go in by yourself or maybe go in with a couple of your friends, and if you need to go AFK, it's not the end of the world like it would be if you were in this pre-made group for a raid. The fact that they're making story mode for raid, so you can do the same thing with the raid content, you can just more casually consume it. and still enjoy and dive deep into the narrative. They're focusing in on solo queue rated battlegrounds and giving battlegrounds more attention for players who just want to log in and do that, and then maybe aren't really focused on just specific, intricate little arena battles that have been going on for some time. So they're definitely focusing in on that audience and trying to give them more options and abilities in the game to keep playing and to stay subscribed. So I thought this was a really good interview overall. And that's why I wanted to cover here in today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments down below. Is this opening up, potential for you to come back to the War Within for World of Warcraft? Do you like the direction that they're taking it at this point? Let me know in the comments down below. Other than that, thank you very much for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one.